There's a particular kind of fear that only shows up in a company once it realizes it might be facing something it genuinely cannot control. Not a competitor it can outspend, not a market it can buy its way into. Something structurally different, something that doesn't play by any of the rules the company has spent decades mastering. That is exactly the kind of fear that settled over Microsoft sometime in the late 1990s as executives slowly came to understand what Linux actually was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. It wasn't a company. It wasn't a product line. It wasn't something you could negotiate with, acquire, or quietly starve of oxygen. And that realization, once it fully sank in, produced one of the most fascinating episodes of corporate anxiety in the entire history of the technology industry. To understand why Microsoft reacted the way it did, you first have to understand just how total its dominance actually was during this period. By the mid-1990s, Windows ran on the overwhelming majority of personal computers sold anywhere in the world. Microsoft controlled the operating system, the dominant Office productivity suite, and increasingly through Internet Explorer, the primary way most people accessed the web. Hardware manufacturers depended on Microsoft's licensing terms to stay in business. Software developers built their products around Windows because that's where the users were, and the users were on Windows because that's where the software was. It was a closed loop, reinforcing itself endlessly, and by the time the decade was ending, there was genuinely no competitor left standing that could challenge Microsoft using anything resembling a conventional business strategy. And then along came something that wasn't a business at all. Linux began in 1991 as a hobby project. A university student in Finland named Linus Torvalds, working largely alone at first, released the source code for a new operating system kernel onto the internet and invited other programmers to help him improve it. There was no company behind it, no board of directors, no product roadmap decided in a boardroom, no marketing department. Just code, released freely with an open invitation for anyone, anywhere to look at it, change it, and contribute back. For the first few years, almost nobody inside Microsoft paid it any real attention. It seemed like exactly what it appeared to be on the surface. A curiosity, a hobbyist project, something built by enthusiasts for other enthusiasts, with no obvious path toward challenging an operating system used by hundreds of millions of ordinary consumers and businesses around the world. That dismissiveness lasted for a while. As late as 1999, Bill Gates was on record describing Linux as no serious threat to Microsoft's core business, framing it as something that lacked the kind of organizational backing and dedicated support infrastructure that real enterprise customers actually required before they would trust their operations to it. It's worth remembering that this wasn't an unreasonable position to hold at the time. Large companies running mission-critical systems typically wanted a vendor they could call when something broke, a support contract, a guarantee, a throat to choke if things went wrong. Linux, in its earliest years, genuinely didn't offer much of that. It was maintained by volunteers. There was no customer service line. If your server crashed, at 3 a.m, there was no guarantee anyone would even see your bug report, let alone fix it on any particular timeline. But something started shifting underneath that confident dismissal. And it happened quietly enough that Microsoft didn't fully register it until it had already become a real problem. Companies running web servers discovered that Linux, despite lacking a formal support apparatus, was remarkably stable, remarkably cheap, and remarkably flexible. You didn't need to pay a licensing fee for every single machine you deployed it on. You could look directly at the source code if something went wrong, rather than waiting on a vendor's timeline to issue a fix. And because so many independent programmers around the world were constantly testing it, poking at it, and improving it in public, bugs tended to surface and get patched with a speed that surprised people used to the slower, more opaque release cycles of traditional commercial software. Universities adopted it. Web hosting companies adopted it. Eventually, some of the largest technology companies on the planet started quietly, building their infrastructure on top of it. And all of this happened in a part of the computing world that Microsoft, for years, had barely bothered to defend, because it had never occurred to the company that this particular battlefield mattered as much as the consumer desktop did. By the time Microsoft's leadership genuinely understood what was happening, the tone inside the company had shifted from confident dismissal to something closer to alarm. That alarm became public in the year 2001, when Microsoft's chief executive at the time, Steve Ballmer, told reporters that Linux was a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. It was an extraordinary thing to say out loud about a piece of freely available software, and it revealed just how seriously Microsoft had come to regard the threat. This wasn't the language of a company that saw a minor annoyance on the horizon. This was the language of a company that had started to genuinely fear it was facing something it might not know how to stop. So why exactly was Microsoft so afraid? The answer isn't simply that Linux was a good product, though it increasingly was. The deeper answer is that Linux represented a fundamentally different kind of competitor than anything Microsoft had ever encountered. And every tool in Microsoft's competitive arsenal had been built to fight a completely different sort of fight. Think about how Microsoft had handled every previous rival. When WordPerfect threatened Microsoft Word's dominance in Word processing, Microsoft could bundle Word into Office, price it aggressively, and lean on its relationships with hardware manufacturers to make sure Word shipped as the default choice on new computers. When Netscape's web browser threatened to become the dominant way people experience the internet, Microsoft built Internet Explorer, gave it away for free, and integrated it directly into Windows itself, making it difficult for ordinary users to even imagine using anything else. When Lotus 1, 2, 3 dominated spreadsheets, Microsoft built Excel and slowly out-executed it over the course of years, backed by the deep pockets and market leverage that came from owning the underlying operating system everyone else's software had to run on top of. Every one of these victories depended on the same basic structural reality. There was a company on the other side of the fight, a headquarters, a revenue stream that could be undercut, a leadership team that could eventually be outcompeted, acquired, or simply outlasted through sheer financial endurance. Microsoft's entire playbook, refined over more than a decade of dominating the personal computer industry, assumed the existence of a corporate opponent with the same basic vulnerabilities every business has: a need for revenue, a need for market share, a need to eventually turn a profit. Linux had none of those vulnerabilities. Because Linux wasn't a business at all, you cannot bankrupt a project that isn't trying to make money in the first place. You cannot outspend a competitor when the competing product costs nothing to acquire and the people building it aren't drawing a paycheck from ticket sales or software licenses. You cannot sign an exclusive distribution agreement that locks out a rival when that rival isn't a single company you can negotiate with, but rather a sprawling, decentralized, ever-shifting community of independent volunteers and eventually dozens of competing corporations that had each independently decided to contribute to the same underlying project without any single one of them actually controlling it. There was no acquisition target. There was no single executive team to pressure. There wasn't even a unified roadmap Microsoft could study and try to out-innovate, because different contributors around the world were often pursuing different priorities simultaneously, guided by their own interests rather than any centralized corporate strategy. This is really the heart of why Microsoft found Linux so genuinely frightening. It wasn't just that Linux was technically capable, though it was. It was that Linux was structurally immune to almost every weapon in Microsoft's arsenal. Fighting Linux using the tools built for fighting Lotus or Netscape was a little like trying to fight a wildfire using tactics designed for a duel. The old rules simply didn't apply, and it took Microsoft's leadership a genuinely uncomfortable amount of time to accept that fact. That fear manifested in a public marketing campaign called Get the Facts, specifically designed to compare Windows favorably against Linux across cost and reliability studies. Unsurprisingly, those studies tended to be funded or shaped in ways that consistently favored Microsoft's own preferred conclusions, which somewhat undermined their credibility even as the campaign ran. But the marketing push was really just the visible surface of a much deeper anxiety running through the company. Behind closed doors and licensing negotiations and internal strategy memos that ordinary computer buyers never saw, Microsoft was working through a far more consequential response to the threat, one that reveals just how seriously the company's leadership had come to take the danger Linux posed. For roughly 15 years, Microsoft had controlled the personal computer industry through a single, extraordinarily powerful lever: its licensing relationship with the hardware manufacturers who actually built and sold the machines running Windows. Every major computer maker on Earth depended on favorable Windows licensing terms to remain profitable, because margins on individual machines were, and remain, notoriously thin in the hardware business. That dependency gave Microsoft a form of leverage that had almost nothing to do with the technical merits of any particular operating system, and everything to do with the structural position Microsoft occupied at the center of an entire industry's supply chain. The executive who oversaw that licensing relationship, a man named Joachim Kempen, became, according to documents that later surfaced in federal litigation, the individual most directly responsible for translating Microsoft's institutional fear of Linux into an actual, coordinated campaign against it. Late in the year 2000, Kempen wrote an internal memo to Ballmer describing his plans in language specific enough that it would eventually be entered as evidence in a federal antitrust case. He described his intention to hit hardware partners harder than Microsoft had in the past with what he explicitly called anti-Linux actions. He talked about restricting source code deliveries wherever feasible, and about being less accommodating in how Microsoft interpreted its existing licensing agreements with manufacturers, all while explicitly cautioning that this needed to be done carefully without drawing obvious attention. He closed with a phrase that somehow captured the entire spirit of the operation. This, he wrote, would be a delicate dance. Sit with the timing of that memo for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. Just months earlier, a federal judge had ruled that Microsoft had illegally maintained its monopoly position in the personal computer operating system market, and had ordered the company split into two separate entities as a remedy. And here in writing was a senior Microsoft executive describing plans to escalate precisely the kind of anti-competitive pressure that had just resulted in that historic conviction. While carefully noting the importance of not being obvious about doing it again, it reveals something important about just how afraid Microsoft actually was of Linux, afraid enough to risk repeating conduct that had already gotten the company in serious legal trouble rather than simply accepting the possibility that Linux might succeed on a level playing field. The specific target of Kempen's memo was Dell. Michael Dell had, not long before, spoken publicly and enthusiastically about his interest in Linux, even investing in Linux-focused companies. That enthusiasm evaporated quickly. Dell quietly pulled Linux from its consumer desktop lineup during the summer of 2001, roughly 6 months after that public declaration of interest. And Kempen had already promised Ballmer he would be putting pressure on computer manufacturers to bring about exactly this kind of industry-wide retreat. The actual mechanism behind this pressure was never a blunt, easily provable ban on selling Linux machines. Internal Microsoft. Documents from this period describe the real policy using carefully hedged language. Hardware manufacturers could, in the company's own internal phrasing, meet demand for Linux machines, but not help create demand for them. In practice, this meant computer makers weren't explicitly forbidden from selling any Linux-based product whatsoever. They were simply discouraged, persistently and quietly, from actively marketing or promoting one. Given that Kempen personally controlled the pricing terms of Windows licensing, any manufacturer that pushed too aggressively on Linux risked losing favorable financial terms or facing exactly the kind of deliberately vague, hard-to-document, unfavorable treatment Kempen had described in his own memo. It was a strategy built from the ground up to leave no fingerprints, engineered specifically to avoid the kind of obvious, easily provable conduct that had already landed Microsoft in federal court once before. And for years, it largely worked. Dell, Compaq, and most of the other major computer manufacturers kept Linux desktops off their flagship consumer product lines, not because ordinary buyers had no interest in them, but because the manufacturers themselves faced genuine financial consequences for promoting them too visibly. This particular approach, using dominant market power in one part of an industry to quietly suppress a rival somewhere else in that same industry, rather than competing purely on technical merit, wasn't actually a new invention for Microsoft. The company had run a strikingly similar operation almost a decade earlier against an entirely different competitor, and understanding that earlier episode helps explain exactly why Microsoft's fear of Linux manifested the way it did. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a company called Digital Research had built a genuinely capable alternative to Microsoft's own MS-DOS operating system, called DR-DOS, which by some industry estimates was actually outselling Microsoft's own product in certain segments of the market during its strongest years. Internal Microsoft engineering code that later surfaced through litigation revealed something remarkable about how the company responded. Early versions of Windows 3.1 had been deliberately engineered to detect whether the underlying operating system was DR-DOS rather than genuine MS-DOS. When that detection was triggered, the software displayed a deliberately alarming, entirely fabricated error message, warning users of possible system instability, despite the fact that DR-DOS actually ran Windows perfectly well. That piece of code became known both inside Microsoft and later in the press as the AARD code, and it eventually led Microsoft to settle a lawsuit brought by DR-DOS's later corporate owner for a sum exceeding $500 million, decades after the original conduct took place. Notice the shape that both episodes share. In each case, a genuinely capable rival product existed. In each case, Microsoft held a structural position of leverage somewhere else in the surrounding ecosystem. Control over error messaging code baked directly into Windows in one instance, control over the licensing terms hardware manufacturers depended on in the other, and in each case, the underlying institutional instinct was the same. Rather than trusting Windows to win a fair fight purely on its own technical merits, Microsoft's leadership reached instead for whatever leverage it could find in the surrounding ecosystem, and did so quietly enough that most ordinary users never even realized a fight was taking place. The DR-DOS episode is really the origin story explaining why Microsoft's fear of Linux expressed itself the way it did. The company had already learned, through direct experience, that quiet, ecosystem-level pressure could be devastatingly effective against a technically capable rival, and it reached instinctively for that same playbook once Linux started to look like a genuine threat. The legal consequences of the anti-Linux campaign specifically did eventually catch up with Microsoft, though slowly. During the remedy hearings that followed Microsoft's original antitrust conviction, Kempen's own memo was entered directly into evidence by a state attorney, and contemporary reporting described it as devastating evidence, not because its language was unusually crude or shocking, but because it demonstrated a company continuing and even actively planning to escalate exactly the kind of conduct a federal court had just ruled illegal months earlier. But here's the piece of this story that genuinely explains the depth of Microsoft's fear, and why that fear, in the end, turned out to be so difficult to resolve through any of the tactics the company actually tried. The entire 15-year campaign, fought through licensing pressure, marketing initiatives, and open public hostility, never actually managed to stop Linux. It slowed certain specific things down. Desktop adoption of Linux among ordinary consumers, particularly in the early 2000s, genuinely did stay smaller than it might otherwise have been, in part because of exactly the kind of manufacturer pressure Kempen's memo described. But Linux was never really fighting for the ordinary consumer desktop as its primary battleground in the first place, and this is precisely the miscalculation that made Microsoft's fear so difficult to actually address through the strategies it chose. While Microsoft poured enormous institutional energy into defending Windows' position on people's home computers, Linux was quietly, almost invisibly, taking over an entirely different and ultimately far more consequential category of computing: servers, and eventually the cloud infrastructure that would come to define the internet's entire underlying architecture. That's really the part of this story worth sitting with directly, because it explains why Microsoft's fear, however intense, was always aimed at least partly at the wrong target. Linux's actual advantages, free to acquire, endlessly customizable, backed by a single home computer. Web hosting companies, universities, and eventually the largest technology companies on the planet adopted Linux specifically because it solved a fundamentally different problem than the one Microsoft was busy defending against on the desktop front. By the time Microsoft's OEM pressure campaign had genuinely succeeded in keeping Linux off a meaningful share of consumer desktops, Linux had already become the dominant operating system running the actual infrastructure of the modern internet, an outcome no amount of licensing pressure aimed at Dell or Compaq's desktop lineup could have ever prevented, because it was unfolding in a market Microsoft's entire pressure campaign had never actually been built to fight in. It's worth pausing here to ask a slightly different question than the one this video started with. Why exactly did this particular threat provoke such an outsized fear response when Microsoft had weathered so many other competitive challenges over the years without anything approaching this level of institutional alarm? Part of the answer lies in the sheer unfamiliarity of what Microsoft was facing. Executives who had spent their entire careers learning to read competitors through the lens of quarterly earnings reports, market share numbers, and boardroom dynamics suddenly found themselves facing something that simply didn't generate any of those familiar signals in the same way. You couldn't read Linux's balance sheet because it didn't have one in any conventional sense. You couldn't predict its next product release by studying a single company's roadmap because there wasn't a single company setting that roadmap. Fear in a business context often comes less from the size of a threat than from the unpredictability of it, and Linux was about as unpredictable a competitor as Microsoft had ever encountered, structurally speaking. There's also a psychological dimension worth naming, honestly. Microsoft had built its entire identity over more than 2 decades around the idea that better business execution, aggressive competition, and sheer market muscle would always eventually win out over any rival, no matter how capable that rival's underlying technology happened to be. Linux quietly challenged that entire worldview, not through some dramatic single moment of confrontation, but through years of slow, steady, largely invisible accumulation of server market share that Microsoft's own. The executives were genuinely slow to notice and even slower to fully process. Realizing that your company's core competitive philosophy might not actually apply to a particular threat is a deeply uncomfortable thing for any organization to confront. And that discomfort likely fed directly into the escalating alarm visible in Microsoft's public statements throughout this period. Eventually, though, something shifted. Not because Microsoft won the fight against Linux, but because the company gradually, and at times reluctantly, came to accept that it had lost a specific piece of that fight, and that continuing to spend enormous institutional energy fighting a battle the underlying market dynamics had already decided was no longer a rational use of its resources. That shift is most commonly and most fairly credited to Satya Nadella, who became Microsoft's chief executive in 2014. Nadella's public declaration that Microsoft loves Linux became almost instantly one of the most quoted lines in the company's entire history, precisely because of how dramatically it contradicted everything Microsoft had said and done about Linux across the previous 15 years. It became something of a running joke across the technology industry for a period afterward, simply because the distance it had traveled from Ballmer's cancer remark felt so enormous. But treating Nadella's declaration as some sudden isolated change in corporate tone misses the far more gradual mechanics of how this transformation actually happened, and why it was ultimately forced by business reality rather than by any sudden shift in corporate sentiment. Microsoft formally joined the Linux Foundation in 2016, a genuinely significant step given the Foundation's role as the central organizing body coordinating Linux kernel development across the entire community. From there, Microsoft's involvement deepened steadily and substantively. The company began contributing code directly to the Linux kernel itself. It built the Windows subsystem for Linux, allowing Windows users to run a genuine Linux environment natively without ever leaving Windows at all. And most significantly, it built Azure, its own cloud computing platform, into a business that depends heavily on Linux running at massive scale across its data centers. That last point deserves particular emphasis, because it's the actual underlying business logic that explains why the fear that had once defined Microsoft's relationship with Linux eventually gave way to something closer to dependency. Azure became one of Microsoft's largest and fastest growing revenue sources, and a substantial share of the actual workloads running on Microsoft's own cloud infrastructure run on Linux rather than Windows, simply because that's what Microsoft's own enterprise customers wanted and demanded from the platform. Microsoft didn't come to embrace Linux out of some newfound disinterested affection for open source software as a philosophy. It came to depend on Linux commercially, at a scale so enormous that continuing the old hostility would have been genuinely irrational from a purely financial standpoint. Microsoft eventually went even further than simply tolerating or supporting Linux running on top of its own infrastructure. The company built and shipped its own Linux distribution entirely, called Azure Linux, quietly running significant portions of Microsoft's internal cloud services for years before the public ever learned it existed, eventually making it more broadly available. Think about the sheer irony embedded in that single fact. The company whose own chief executive once compared Linux to a cancer eventually designed, built, and maintained a genuine Linux distribution of its own, not as some symbolic public gesture, but as real, functional infrastructure quietly running a meaningful share of Microsoft's own cloud business. It's worth being honest about the limits of this transformation, because presenting it as a complete, uncomplicated reversal would oversimplify a genuinely more complicated picture. Microsoft's relationship with Linux and the broader open source world today is considerably better than it was during the Ballmer era, but it isn't purely uniformly friendly even now. This channel has covered, in other videos, more recent friction points worth remembering here. Dual boot systems breaking after routine Windows updates, secure boot certificate transitions, catching Linux users off guard with minimal warning, Microsoft Teams behaving inconsistently across different web browsers, specifically on Linux systems. None of these newer episodes resemble the same kind of deliberate, documented pressure campaign that Kempen's memo described decades earlier. But together, they suggest a pattern worth naming honestly. Even in an era of genuine institutional acceptance, friction between Windows' continued market dominance and the everyday experience of actual Linux users keeps resurfacing in smaller, far less centrally coordinated forms, hinting that the underlying tension between these two philosophies of software was never fully erased. It simply stopped being an explicit, top-down corporate strategy handed down from executives. So, pulling all of this together, why exactly was Microsoft so afraid of Linux in the first place? The honest answer weaves together several distinct threads at once. Linux's decentralized, community-owned structure meant there was never a single company, a single set of executives, or single licensing agreement Microsoft could meaningfully target in order to slow the underlying project's technical development, the way it could against an ordinary corporate competitor. Linux's genuine advantages showed up first and most decisively in markets, servers, and later cloud infrastructure. That Microsoft's actual fear-driven pressure campaign, built entirely around consumer-facing hardware relationships, was never structurally positioned to fight in at all, and the fear itself was amplified by sheer unfamiliarity. Microsoft had never before faced a competitor that didn't generate any of the usual signals a company relies on to size up a threat, which made the danger feel simultaneously enormous and impossible to fully pin down. There's a broader lesson embedded in this entire story, one that extends well beyond this single rivalry. Microsoft, across the late 1990s and early 2000s, was an extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily well-resourced company, fully capable of exerting real, documented pressure across an entire industry's hardware ecosystem. And none of that power turned out to be the right tool for the specific kind of threat Linux actually represented. Fear, in this case, came not from Linux being unbeatable in any single confrontation, but from the fact that Linux simply didn't offer Microsoft a confrontation it knew how to have. You can build a better product. You can outmarket a rival. You can outnegotiate a supplier. You cannot, it turns out, negotiate with a decentralized, freely replicating, community-owned project the same way you negotiate with a company, any more than you can negotiate with the weather. You can build better shelter. You cannot actually make it stop raining through a licensing agreement. Microsoft eventually figured that out, decades later than it arguably should have, and changed strategy completely. Not because its institutional values shifted overnight, but because the underlying economics of its own business eventually left it no other rational choice. The company that once feared Linux enough to compare it publicly to a disease now runs enormous amounts of its own infrastructure on top of it, contributes code directly to its kernel, and builds products specifically designed to make Windows and Linux work together rather than treating one as an existential threat to the other. That's not really a story about Microsoft becoming a fundamentally different, more virtuous company. It's a story about what happens when even the most powerful company in an entire industry runs directly into something its whole competitive playbook simply was never built to fight, and has to sit with the uncomfortable process of figuring that out in real time. I want to know how you read this particular fear now that you've seen the fuller picture behind it. Does it strike you as a rational response to a genuinely novel competitive threat? Or does it feel, in hindsight, like an overreaction rooted more in unfamiliarity than in any accurate read of the actual danger Linux posed? And given how thoroughly Microsoft's posture eventually reversed, do you think there's a lesson here for how any dominant company should think about threats that don't look like traditional competitors at all? Let me know in the comments. I think fear, as a subject in corporate history, gets far less attention than strategy or execution. And this particular episode is one of the clearest examples of just how much fear alone can shape a company's decisions for the better part of 2 decades. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories behind the technology that shaped our world, subscribe to Hidden Historian. There's another story waiting to be uncovered.